All right, so today is February 9th, 2022. This is Kalyna Somchynsky from URDC interviewing Chrystia Chomiak for the Local Narratives Project. And today we will be focusing on Chrystia's own activity within the feminist movement in Edmonton and the Ukrainian Canadian community. So to begin, could you describe some of your memories growing up in the Ukrainian community at various points in your life? And I know we've already met once and you've discussed growing up and your parents. So if there's just anything you haven't covered or that's quite specific to yourself, feel free to take some time to explore that now.
Thank you, Kalyna. So yeah, so I've thought a great deal about this particular question because the community, as I talked about before, was very vibrant. But my personal experiences were both that it was, a very exciting and interesting place, and also feeling very other, being outside and being different. So, so it's the combination of those two. I think that our entire family, that is of the siblings, felt that we were different, right? We had an understanding that we were not the same. So, so in terms of the aspirations, etc., of people of our immigration, and what was valued, it was different in our family. And so we had a very real understanding that somehow we were different. And I especially, those are my memories. In any group, and we were all sent to Plast. In any group, you can have a really good group of comrades, people that companions and friendly. And you can also have, and this was that you have some really mean girls, right? It's like growing up, in school. And so because you're a small community, you don't have many options, right? You go to this group and that's where you are. And so it was not only that we felt a little different, and I felt, different, but that I also felt that there was so much competition and some meanness within that. So that was also part of growing up within that community. As a child, that's one thing, but as a teenager especially, I felt some alienated, and I was expelled from Plus, for instance. So I became a hippie, and in high school, so, wore the clothes, and I'm not sure why I did this. Walked around with bare feet, like, what is that? And I would come to Plus meetings in not my uniform, but in, bell-bottom pants, and, I probably had long hair, maybe not, maybe yes, but I didn't fit the norm. I felt that I was a rebel, right? I found these constraints of uniform and expectations to be very alienating and not who I was. So in high school, one of the things, for instance, I did is that I tried to form a New Democratic Youth at my high school, and my principals, took me aside and said, we don't do politics as a club. You can't do that. And I think, anyhow, I remember that particular argument with him. And of course he was correct, right? You don't have, young conservatives and New Democratic Youth. And at that time, New Democratic Youth, just for was a much more radical group. And at one time, later on, they were asked to disband by the New Democrats because we were too radical. So I was very attracted by the counterculture, and so as a teenager, and there was a clash between that and the norms in the Ukrainian community, right? So that's one of the things that I remember growing up.
And so how did these experiences shape your interests and ambitions, perhaps when you started university or started your early career?
So how that shaped it is that I always wanted to be part of social action, actions that challenge what I considered authoritarian rules that were oppressive. So when I went to university, there was a huge disconnect. I wanted to be active, and it took me a long time to focus in on what it is that I would study. Right. So I studied a number of things. So I can go through those, but anyhow, tried out different departments, and what was missing for me was always it didn't feel like what I wanted to do in my life, right? So it didn't answer that burning desire to be part of political change, right? To be part of social action. And that was always trying to put those two things together.
Now, I know that you were involved in SUSK at some point. Could you describe how you became involved in the student activism within the Ukrainian community, and specifically focusing on SUSK?
Yes, so how I got involved in SUSK, so I was at the University of Alberta. I was studying, I was in the education department at that time and studying theater arts. And my friend Marusa Petrician, who was previously Kucharishan, she was one of the persons that was a very nice person. Wasn't one of the mean girls. She was a very nice person, and we always got along well. And I think it must have been in 1968. Anyhow, she convinced me to join the Ukrainian Students Club, which was then developing. So I joined the club, and shortly after joining, I became the president. As these things happen, they go, oh, good, new person, you're the president. We'll elect you as president. Okay, sure. I mean, probably because of my desire for activism, right, to do something. So I became the president of the SUSK, of the local Ukrainian Students Club at the University of Alberta. And in the spring of '69, there was a national conference of presidents of Ukrainian students clubs in Toronto. And that's where I met Hromada Petrician, who was really behind this gathering. He had gotten the grant, which Hromada is always good at. Anyhow, he got the grant to bring people down, and we came down. And what we approved at that conference was to hire students for the summer to organize. And what were we focusing on was we were focusing on a conference in Vancouver that year, right? So that was how I got involved, and I really liked, of course not all, but I really liked the dynamic discussions that we had, and meeting others who were maybe not 100%, but we were all being influenced by our time, right, and wanting to be more active and to challenge norms, right? So that was very attractive to me. And so in the summertime, when the people came by, there were 3 of them. They all stayed at my house, at my parents' house, that is, not my house. My lucky parents were always the hosts of these, for all of us, not just me, but for all of us, right? So they were hosted at our place. Anyhow, and it was very interesting, and that's where I met Bogdan Kravchenko, who had been invited to be, or who had gotten one of the positions to be, to work in organizing the Ukrainian students. And we had many discussions, and I found that we had very similar views. And so I was very motivated, and we were able, in Edmonton, I think we had something like, and I can't, this is all memory, but we had the largest contingent that came down from Edmonton to Vancouver. We had, I think it was something like 50 people that we had from Edmonton. It was a very successful campaign. And we went by train from Edmonton to Vancouver. Then the trains were good. I mean, they weren't like today, but they were a real form of transportation. And it was a great conference, and I felt at home there, and that's why I got involved in SUSK, because my activism, my Ukrainianism, came together, and they weren't separate, right? They weren't separate, and they were also, so the other like-minded people were there, and so that's how I got involved. And that fall, I moved to Toronto, and I started attending first Ryerson, and then later on, I went to the University of Toronto. Attended the University of Toronto. So that's how I got involved. It was because I found like-minded people, and I was able to bring in those my concerns.
And how did this work that you were doing with SUSK, and perhaps exploring in other facets of your life, work to advocate for a policy of multiculturalism in Canada?
Okay, so growing up in Alberta, it doesn't matter where in Canada, I imagine it was all very similar. You had a real hierarchy of which ethnic groups were on top and which weren't. And there was a policy of assimilation. That's really what, but there was just an awful lot of discrimination against other groups. And so other mean non-Anglos, not from Britain. The British people were on top. The French were always fighting to be recognized, and then everybody else was below. And where I saw that play out in real life was the way that my mother was treated. My father had a little bit of a better life. For one thing, he was a man, and he got work at in a place where there were a lot of other Ukrainians from that immigration. He worked at Sherrod Gordon in Fort Saskatchewan in the lab, and the head of that lab and the CEO of the company was Ukrainian from the immigrant. He had developed a process that helped in the refining of in the refining process, and he hired his acquaintances, those people that needed work, and so he worked within that. My mother tried to get jobs as well, and she was not, and people, she had a much my father didn't have as heavy of an accent, a Ukrainian accent. My mother did. And because of that, she was not welcomed. So she tried to get a job in the retail sector, and that was, you know, she couldn't do that. So she ended up working in a dry cleaning establishment, right? So experienced firsthand the discrimination that people faced as both as immigrants, but you know, Ukrainians had been here since the 1890s. So and that also was a real rub, right? So it's, one is the immigrant experience, and secondly, if you were Ukrainian, if you kept, you know, your name, if you hadn't assimilated, right, you were many doors were just locked and you couldn't go forward. So that was a real, that was a real formidable experience. So what happened in the 1960s in Canada is, firstly, we had the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission, which had a real effect, right? So I was in high school, but that, you know, so it was a topic of great conversation, and, you know, I read about it and it felt really, really positive. And that opened the door for other groups to say, well, that's great. We're here as well, and we should also have rights, right? Now, how you interpret that was different. You know, many people in the Ukrainian community, and to this day, well, not to this day, things have changed significantly, but at that time, wanted to have special status for Ukrainians. They weren't interested in helping other ethnic groups. They felt, you know, so there was that was a very strong feeling. For me, what I felt is that you had to work with other ethnic groups, that you needed to have a policy for all groups in Canada, so that you had equal rights, you know, regardless. So in SUSK, we had these discussions, you know, what does that look like? Is it special status? Is it equal status? Where does language fit in, right? So we agreed that we had a country that had, you know, two main languages, English and French. And we felt, you know, while we can keep Ukrainian, you know, and support Ukrainian language development, but it wasn't, it could never be, you know, other than the language of a particular group, right? That used it. The question of status of other groups was on the table, and we as SUSK had many discussions. So how did that take place? You know, I'm sure that we had those discussions at our conference in Vancouver. I am sure that in the spring when we met, you know, when the presidents met, that could have very well have been on the agenda as well. But really, in Toronto, it was a group of us, and we would meet. We had a little office on Harvard and Spadina, and we would meet there. We'd go to a restaurant, you know, and sit around and talk, right? Or we'd meet at the University of Toronto in some room, right? And we would discuss these matters at length. So that's how it came. And of course, my experience that I told you is one, but everybody else had a similar experience, you know, whether it was for them or their parents, right? That, or just seeing the discrimination. So it was really intense at that time. that doesn't exist anymore. And that was at that time that I started calling myself Chrystia. I changed because my name is Christina, and on my, Christina, right? But Christina to me was too English, right? It was too easy to not be seen as a white woman, right? I could assimilate, and so I wanted to be there. So I mean, my family always called me Chrystia, right? So it wasn't a huge stretch. I didn't invent it. I just took that name as mine. So anyhow, so so how we discussed it, it was a major issue, and we became very involved in it and discussed, how is it that we're going, what can we do? And again, Roman Petrician, what he did is that it was a call to action. It was a philosophy, or when it's really quite simple. When there's a problem, organize around it. No, it's not new, but it was a very well articulated, and it was something that we all read, and thought, yes, that's what we can go, and we can work with others to make this happen. So that's how how SUSK got involved in multiculturalism, because it was on the cards, right? And we actually developed a policy of multiculturalism. And, so we agreed, on the language question, on equality of all cultures in Canada, and having access to support from the federal and provincial governments for our activities. Where we were blind on two things, on race and on First Nations. So on First Nations, we say, well, we're all the same. Well, we're not all the same, right? And First Nations, people from the very beginning, there was, we're not the same, right? And it took, me personally, a while to be able to work through how it is that we're not all, the idea, if we're all the same, yes, you absolutely, your culture is great, blah, 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 wonderful support, but it's different when you're an Indigenous group. It's different. There's a different status. And that was a big hole that in our policy and in our understanding. And also we, white kids didn't understand, didn't appreciate the question of race within this, right? So it was extremely idealistic at that. I would say our policy was extremely idealistic, and later on, those are the questions that where there was friction, and again, when there's friction, there's resolution, right? Hopefully, right? And so now we have that as Canada has identified First Nations and Métis groups as in their rightful place, right? That's still, of course, a huge process, but that's a part of it. And the question of race is really important, right? So that it's not simple.
And when you were working through these questions, did you, your reflections on the holes that you identified, that you at that time didn't recognize the significance of race and First Nations identity to your conception of multiculturalism? Were these reflections you had later in time, thinking about your activity? Yeah,
absolutely. And unfortunately, no longer with that same group. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So no longer did we have a forum or a place for that kind of discussion, because we were no longer a group, right? And so it was much more individual. individual reckoning and understanding. And again, within the Ukrainian community, which was always quite conservative and continues to be, there was no forum for that kind of a discussion. At that time, and I would say in the 70s and certainly in the 80s, just selling multiculturalism, right? That Ukrainians don't have a special place, right? That we're not, there are many special, right? You can many special. So understand that, you can be very proud and understand, what it is that, the experience of Ukrainians and what Ukrainians have brought to the general culture, right? But for me, as a specifically, special status was always, I always had a challenge with that because I grew up with all kinds of people, right? And I did not feel that one group should be better than another. And that was what we were fighting against, or at least to me, special status for English, though understanding, I mean, we're speaking in English, right? There is a special status, but that's that you had to fight it, that is what we were fighting against, is the special status for one. So then you don't take it on and say, yeah, I want it for me.
Now, how did some of the work that you were doing with SUSK and thinking about multiculturalism intersect with feminist principles that you were upholding? So, for example, some of the articles that you wrote for SUSK.
What I think that it was more in terms of our participation, my participation within SUSK and advocating for equal rights for women and making that a central part of our functioning, right? So that and always having that as part of the agenda, part of our action, part of our interaction with each other within the group. So that was much more to the point. So in that, specifically, because I grew up in a family where there were 5 girls and 1 boy, and my poor brother, he was the youngest, and a very strong mother and a very strong father, but a very strong mother who, while she fit a very traditional role, she also was a very non-traditional. So it's both, but very strong view, very clear views, very strong views, different from my father's, etc. So the give and take was constant there. So it was a great example. So but we, the girls in the family, were very supportive of one another, and when I was still in Edmonton, in the women's movement, people and where it was something that both I read about and it would be something that I talked about with my sisters, and especially my sister Hala, and also my sister Natalka. But so we would read, and then we would talk, and how does that, and make it part of our lives, right? Or say, oh yes, this is what we, so our conscious raising and support for other women. So that would have been my action. So I was always a strong supporter of other women within SUSK, and wanting and making sure that women played a key role within the organization, because you had some very heavy some very strong male characters within that. So being able to also have strong women in there, and that women weren't reduced to, you know, being secretaries and making coffee, which was that wasn't on the card, you know, that wasn't on the cards then, but that was not something that we would do, right? And having a lot of support. So that was how my feminism with SUSK. So it just being a strong advocate for women's participation and support for one another. We didn't have a separate group, but we certainly, you know, talked about it a lot, you know, and worked strongly with one another and supported one another. So the kind of, you know, friendships and bonds that we made there continued to today, right? And yeah, so it was not an informal but very strong women's group.
And could you talk a little bit about this action or happening that you staged in regards to a beauty pageant in the Ukrainian community?
So yeah, so when I came to Toronto, I was the editor of Student, and in Toronto there is the headquarters of many Ukrainian newspapers. I put that in quotes because those newspapers, and they continue to this day, are really the newspaper of a political party. You know, so the Banderівці have Голос України, the Менниківці had Новий шлях, and there was a whole pile. What was exciting for me is to see so many newspapers, because in Edmonton you didn't have that. You had one community newspaper, and that was Svoboda. We had a community newspaper. Now, there may have been smaller ones, but everybody wrote in the quote, you know, nationalist community as a quote, and the communists had theirs. But the you know, in the nationalist community, you had Svoboda, which was a general community and newspaper. And if I'm correct, I believe that it started before the Second World War, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyhow, so I can't answer that, but I do think it did. So, so you had, anyhow, so in Toronto, you have all these smaller newspapers that are very ideological, and they were horrible. They were just horrible because, you know, there was no information and there was just ideology, one ideology or another one. You know, the Catholics had, you know, the Orthodox, but and the monarchists had theirs. You know, so you had all kinds of things. Anyhow, but what they had, because you had so many, you had a council of Ukrainian press, and Student was invited. Okay, that sounds all right. We'll be. And then they invited us to take part in the beauty pageant. And I looked at that. How is this? It's a beauty pageant, and I think, oh, what is so? There's a scholarship at the end, you know, that you get, but it's a beauty pageant. I don't think it was in swimsuits, but you had to have a gown. You paraded, right? And it's women who wrote or were part of a newspaper were invited to participate in this beauty pageant. To me, that was just outrageous. When I read that letter, I was so angry, you know, discussed with my fellow people in SUSK. We were all outraged. And so we organized a demonstration, you know, wrote back, thanks, but no thanks, we will not be participating. And in Toronto, it was at the pageant. It was a yearly pageant. So or a contest, and they had a banquet, contest, banquet, probably a zabava afterwards, the traditional kind of things that happen. Anyhow, or agenda. Anyhow, so what we decided to do is that we would come there and we would picket the concert. And so we went back and forth, and we had this as our on our placards. That was the we went to a part of our group, extended group. I mean, he was an artist by the name of Ihor Kordyuk, who is just a brilliant artist. Unfortunately, he passed away probably 15 years ago. He died of lung cancer, but he was really, really interesting. And we went to him. Actually, I went to him. My sister Natalka lived in a house, and on various floors there were different people. He lived on, I think, the top floor. Natalka and her friend Marta Odinek lived on the middle floor. Anyhow, so it was, people went back and forth in that house, and we asked him, or I asked him, can he do, this is what we're doing. Will you support him? He said, absolutely. He's right there with us. And would he draw something for our poster? And he drew this. I mean, he just sat down and he drew it. I can't say 5 minutes, but he drew it, and I thought it was just brilliant. And so that was what we had on our posters, and we printed that off, and that was our leaflet. So on one page, that was that. And then we wrote, our positions, that this was outrageous, that so instead of celebrating journalism, you have a beauty pageant for women. And the community that came there, they were just shocked. They were in huge shock, and they came out to talk to us, and different people. When I say that, and they'd say, how can you demonstrate against us? We're all, I mean, these were primarily immigrants. We're all immigrants. We're all being discriminated against. And here you are demonstrating against us. And we said, yeah, because you have a practice that is very demeaning to women. So they canceled the beauty pageant, and they brought it back about 10 years after, but it took them 10 years. It took them a good chunk of time before they had the nerve, and they saw that there was no opposition, and they brought it back, right? But so that was an action that we took. I mean, we as a group did other things, but this one was great. Every time you have an action, you have to, it was all the discussion, etc. And our group, I mean, how many people? Maybe we had 20 people that were, demonstrating in front. It wasn't big, it was small, right? But it was the shock to see their children, so, demonstrating against them was such a shock. And we made the point, and they understood it. They understood the point, which was the whole point of that, right? So, didn't become feminists, but understood that you cannot demean women this way, right? So.
It was an intervention, a disruption. It
was a disruption that worked, which was great. Not all disruptions work.
Exactly. Now, you've touched on this a little bit already, but do you remember perhaps how you became involved or started becoming aware of the need to fight for women's rights, especially when you were living in Edmonton? And I know you've touched on this already, talking about your family and your sister, but is there anything you'd like to add on that topic?
I not really. I mean, there was a group, and I can't, it was quite informal, and so I can't remember how it is that I got involved in it, or but a conscious raising group. It was probably at the University of Alberta, right? But the specifics around it, I can't tell you, right? But I certainly remember some of the discussions. But how I got involved, how long did this group happen? How many were, all of that around it, I can't remember, right? So conscious raising groups were very important. Again, as I said, that I was very lucky because the one that I was involved in here in Edmonton was very supportive. And when I went to Toronto, my first one was not. Supportive as supportive, and so I had to look around, right? It was all of these are growing experiences, right? Finding the discussions. What I found in Toronto is that the discussions in Toronto were much more polarized already then. So you had lesbians, you had the radical lesbians that didn't want to have anything to do with men. You had very articulated different groups within the women's movement, and so therefore it was and a real competition for membership, right? So as a new person coming in, right, there was a lot of fighting for, right, allegiance and support, because as opposed to being a group that supported one another, right? So that was to me an immediate difference, and it took me a while to find the right kind of people that I wanted to be with, or that were nurturing, and also recognizing, is this nurturing? I don't think so, right? And working through that. Am I supposed to be going through this? Feeling really uncomfortable, and working all of that out. Anyhow, so it was a different political landscape there than it was here, where you had a much smaller group and people, for whatever reason, supported one another, right? It just luck, I think.
Now, moving on, I'm going to switch our topic and ask you to speak a little bit more in depth about the Second Wreath Conference, which was a feminist conference that you helped to organize. So perhaps let's begin with, could you describe what your role was in helping to organize this conference?
Right. So, a couple of different things. So, the initial impetus for it came from my sister Hala, who was taking courses at the University of Alberta in Ukrainian language and literature, and I read about the first conference and said, it's going to be 100 years. We need to celebrate this. And so, she assembled various peoples to make this, to do something. And the idea was to have a conference, and not just a conference, it was also to do a few other things. One of the things was to acknowledge women in the Ukrainian community who have made a real contribution. So there was a banquet, and there was that. That was one of the things that was organized. And then the second thing was a conference. And the idea was to bring, for us to be able to discuss what are the concerns that we have, both as feminists and specifically as Ukrainian feminists. How do other feminists and other groups, what are they doing? And what are they doing? And also to connect to the broad range of Ukrainian women activists. So when I say broad range, so from the first people from the first and second immigration, those women, people in the United States from the post-World War II immigration. And I say people, it's always women. We did have men speak at the conference, so it wasn't entirely, but the goal was not, let's connect with men. The goal was to connect with the SUSK in different parts of North America, and to have them involved in the conference, or for them to participate in the conference, and to have other Ukrainian feminists. So what was my role? My role was, firstly, I had contacts across the whole country because of my activism in Toronto. In Toronto, just as an aside, there were two organizations that I was involved in spearheading and developing. One was called Action for Women's Rights in the USSR. So that was a group that I started with. Of course, you have to have. It's not a one-man band. It was a much larger group. And the other one was Committee in Defense of Ukrainian Political Prisoners. And so we, and there, we organized, but meetings, demonstrations, discussions, inviting people who, were working on these areas to speak, speakers, so it also coalesced a whole group of people, right? Primarily women, around these issues, around these actions, or around these committees. So, and SUSK was active throughout Canada, right? And I had contacts with women. So what I would say is my main contribution to the conference is that I was able to connect with people and say, hey, we're having this conference. We'd like you to participate, for you to be part of it, from, let's say, Winnipeg, from Toronto, can you guys come, or, what would you like to see? So being able to bring them in, and people would say, oh yeah, sure. Right. So it was still part of that whole movement, right? And specifically women. So I would say that was my main contribution, is being able to pull in that broader group. And then the other, I'd say the other thing that I'm most proud of at the conference itself is I had the closing statements, or the closing remarks at the conference. And what I was able to do is to pull together groups that had been all came to the conference, but we had that never coalesced. We're actually quite separate. And there was alienation. So for instance, Sabella Statistician was asked to speak. A whole bunch of people came out. It was really quite phenomenal. She spoke so it was at the University of Alberta, and I think primarily in the Faculty of Education, but one of those large halls, not a small one, but a large hall, and it was full. So it was phenomenal to see all these people come out, and and to see the amount of support, what an effect she had, and continued to have, for a long period of time. And so that was, but what I saw is that because it was all concurrent sessions, people went to what they wanted, right? So our generation went to what we wanted. Right? So by having concurrent sessions, because we wanted to cover everything, right? Yeah, we in fact didn't bring any. We were in danger of losing what we had built, and so that's what I was proudest at. It is bringing, acknowledging, talking about, and bringing those people, the various groups together. And so, yeah, so that's what I'm proudest of at that, because, because, 100 years. So we were a very dynamic group, and, but we made a point of inviting others, right? And saying, we want you to be part of us, or we want to have a discussion. We want to do this together, right? So being able to bring that together was very important for me.
And do you remember perhaps some of the, could you name some of the groups or individuals who were invited to participate at this conference?
Yeah, so we invited, so first, SUSK Chomiak, major. First Wreath was organized by SUSK Chomiak. That was theirs, right? So Second Wreath was essential for them to be involved. And so that was very interesting to have them. And I would say that in many, or my view of them changed significantly, not entirely, because we always have a very mixed group, mixed membership. But if you looked at their publications, they really advocated for a very traditional role for women. Raising of children, passing on of culture, having good domestically. Now, I love to cook, but when it is an expectation, that's what you are, right? That was for me where the problem occurred, right? It's not the activity. And I made a point of raising my children, having them speak Ukrainian, right? So so in many ways I did those things, but it was a question of what is the expectation of women that was the sore point for me and for others, right? So you see that very true, and no support for feminists. That's the other thing. Here you have a vibrant feminist movement that's fighting for equal rights on many levels. And here you have theoretically a Ukrainian women's organization that is not part of that, right? So if you were suffragette, if you were fighting for rights, start fighting for rights, so there's a lot of tension. So what was interesting for me in that particular group was to see old activists who in fact supported, now not all, but some, and having discussions with them, right? So again, you can't paint the whole with one brush, right? But meeting those women from SUSK Chomiak. The other group that or individuals that we invited were people from other ethnic groups. So our keynote speaker was a prominent feminist from New York who was Jewish. And so for us in our group, it was really we would read, how do you combine feminism and following Jewish traditions, right? Like how do you do that? So and they were way ahead of the curve, right? We were so that caused a lot of challenges, right? With there was a lot of discussion. How can you do that? Don't we have someone? And the answer is no. And at that point, no, we don't. Or we could, but that would be very insular. So trying to bring in others to be part of this discussion and to be part of who we were. It was always important for us to go outside of our. So who were the other people? So and then making sure that we had people from different immigrations, right? That it's not because the post-World War II immigration in some places just completely eliminated all the ones from before. But growing up in Edmonton, where you had still a very vibrant community from the other immigrations, you saw, that was very valuable. So having them, and then we had support from general feminist women's organizations in Edmonton, right? To have that support from the larger women's community, and we wanted them to know that we had a past in the feminist or a women's rights past. Yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Oh, very much so. Thank you. Now, why would you say this conference was important? Like looking back historically, why would you say it was significant what you did?
Well, at that time, people, it brought women, it brought us closer to the Ukrainian women's organizations. So, and there was a lot of fear mongering, of course, because we were radical, especially in comparison to the Ukrainian community. It was very conservative. So this is an example. So there was a woman, and we had just built the co-op. We had just moved into the co-op. And so we were still in the process. We didn't have all the porches weren't up, the buildings were there, but not all the porches, etc. Anyhow, so it was still like in the finishing parts of it. And we were, the view that many people had is that we were this commune, and communists and a commune and the whole thing. And there were two women in probably my age now that wanted to see this commune, and I drove them over, and we drove around. And the minute they saw that it was duplexes, they said, "Oh, we thought you were a commune." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "At one point we did talk about having having collective things and things in common, but the reality is that we really didn't want that." We do want things in common, but not necessarily living. They go, "Oh," they said, "these are just townhouses," or "this is just, they don't," because these women are from Toronto, "these are just townhouses that you." She says, "I'm going to go back there and tell them they're all wrong." So, the view of us as being unapproachable. So that was, I think, the success. And also it kept, and then another thing is that it kept women that were active in the past continue to be active, right? Because, it gave you more, another energy to continue, right? And that you were not alone. That is really, that you're not alone, that we are strong in our numbers, right? So, and that continued for a while.
And what would you say was a challenge that you encountered in this process?
The challenge is that we weren't able to capitalize as much as we should have been able to capitalize on. It's a question of we tried to put out, what we decided to do is that we would put out a publication of the main proceedings. And we went through a process of editing, and there was a group of us, Myrna, Olenka, myself, Hala, and I'm not sure who else was in that group, but I know that the four of us were. I'm sure that there was somebody else, and I'm sorry, but I've forgotten who the other person or persons were, we found it a real challenge to edit the materials because it was so wide, and some people just gave us notes, and some people had a presentation, and I don't think that we understood the value, or we didn't appreciate the value, and didn't see that we could in fact put this out. So I think that was one of the real challenges afterwards, you know. Yeah. So yeah.
So after this conference, I know there was a smaller conference, Second Wreath Conference, that took place in Toronto. Could you tell me about organizing that conference? In what ways was it similar or different from the one in Edmonton?
So I went to that conference. It was organized in Toronto by the Toronto group. And they actually formed a group. And Ola Kuplowska was key to that. And it was a conference there. I don't remember a lot about it because I came with my daughter, and she was, I don't know, she was very young. And it was in Edmonton. I had a whole support group, including my husband, who looked, so my participation was much higher, but there I didn't. And so I was limited in that participation. So it was smaller. It wasn't as ambitious. We were very ambitious, bringing in lots of people. And Hromada was very clever at getting funding, right? So we were able to bring in people. And so it wasn't as ambitious, and it wasn't as broad. And I would say the difference also is that it didn't involve people from outside of the Ukrainian community. Whereas here we did on many levels, right? Discussions on gender, sexuality. It was much broader, and they're not. There it was much it was narrower. But the actual papers from it, it would be interesting to take a look to see what they had to say.
Excellent. Now, if you could pull one memory from this conference, one highlight, is there one that sticks out to you more than others?
The whole process of to me, it's the dynamism that we had in the organizing committee, right? And how excited we were by being able to bring in all these different components, which also pulled it apart. Right? So if ever, lessons learned is not to have concurrent sessions, or to maybe only have a choice of 2. I think we had like 3 or 4 going at the same time, right? And in different buildings, and you had to understand. Being a student at the University of Alberta, and walking around. Of course, we had maps and everything, for people to make their way. But so having being dynamic, but you want to have it. You also want it to come together. Yeah, I think that I've talked about the most important moments. Yeah.
Perfect. And to conclude today, I was wondering if you could envision the brightest possible future for the Ukrainian Canadian community. What does it look like?
Oh, so for me, go past these ideological groups that we live in. I mean, so that the general organizations are actually general. They have become much more open than in the past, but they move so at a very slow pace. so that it is welcoming and to all kinds of people with different points of view. And it's still not there. So, so that's how I would see it. That's how my ideal community would be, right? So that when I go to an event, it's not the same old political message that is being, that is redecorated a little bit, but it's the same old message. That we have a pride in who we are, but that we are also extremely welcoming. The other thing that I would like the community to be is to be to understand its history and therefore and its past, and be able to be more welcoming to others and to play a role in that. So one of the things, you know, we have a social services, and we have a new immigration, right? And that immigration, it absolutely needs our support, you know, especially, you know. So I don't begrudge that, and I don't think that that should be eliminated. But I also think that because we understand that, we should be also welcoming others and to use our strength and experience to help others. That would be very nice for me, and not to be so isolated. So, so yeah, and I guess the last thing that I would like our community is for us to start bridging the and coming to terms with our past, with our First Nations communities. That to me, I think is really important. But I don't think that it is important to the vast, vast majority of Ukrainians. I don't think it's on their radar at all. And in fact, I think that there's hostility towards First Nations. Not maybe explicitly, you know, I think that there is. And I think that we really need to, so I would like us to be broader in that. And you know, it again, all these things, you know, you confront, you discuss, you move forward, right? But I think that that is, for us, it would be, you know, I would love to see it. I know that there are the beginnings of those kind of initiatives. They're very small. They're very small, and so yeah. So I'd like them to be much more than they are. I have more people talking about it, more people, you know, questioning and reaching out, or, you know, finding ways, finding where are those bridges? How do we do this, right? How do we do that as a group? Not what we have are individuals, and we've always had individuals who've got always, right? So it's the individuals, yes, but as a group, how do we as a group? What do we do as a group? So I'd like, you know, that would be part of our future. It would be really good. We live in Canada, right? We need to get together. And we have to understand our past. Our past is not good, as far as our past is in fact bad. We've been, you know, now again, individuals, there's always been individuals who don't fit that and are another example. But it's as a community, we have been discriminatory towards our First Nations people. We need to come to terms with it.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts with me.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure talking to you, Kalyna.
Excellent. I'm glad. Is there anything you'd like to add today before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think that we've covered I covered everything. You know, on your questions, and I had a few notes. So yeah, I think that yeah.
Perfect.